It was a mild Friday evening in late September when I turned off the county road and followed the washboard lane into Kettle Ash Reserve. I'd been there once years back with a group, but this time I wanted the quiet that comes when the summer crowds thin and the map kiosks collect dust. I parked at a pullout near mile 7. Shouldered a simple kit, 2 liters of water, a small stove, a tarp tent, and hiked in along Cedar Hollow Trail until the trees crowded close and the light took on that green, underwater look. I set my camp on a knoll above a trickle of water, cooked noodles, and watched the last color drain from the sky. It felt ordinary in the best way. Sometime after midnight I woke up because the forest had gone blank. No crickets, no small things ticking in the duff, nothing. I told myself wind can do that. A pressure change. A hawk moving somewhere unseen. Then a footfall landed just beyond my tarp, heavy enough to be human, careful enough to be trying not to be heard. I didn't sit up or speak. I let my eyes adjust to the seam of darker dark where the guy line ran, and I listened. Another step, placed with the faint crunch of last year's needles. Then a pause long enough to count my own breath twice. I said, "Hey," normal voice, like you do when you're not looking for a fight. The steps retreated without hurry. I lay still a long time after, then drifted off because bodies insist on sleep even when brains on single quotes did that morning showed prints I didn't recognize. Not animal. Boot tread with a shallow chevron through the midsole and small round lugs at the heel. The stride was longer than mine and favored the outside edge like someone with a sore knee. They came up from the creek, passed through the soft area by my cook spot, and stopped where I should have been most visible from the trees. Then they backed away. Not random. I packed a day bag and followed Cedar Hollow downstream to Lake Marin Spur. Along a straight stretch I caught new color on bark, bright orange thumbtacks pressed into a fir at eye level. 2 more on the next tree, then 3. They lined up to make a lane in the understory, not for me to find a viewpoint, but for someone to measure where I'd walk. 10 yards past the last tack, a thin cord stretched shin-high between 2 saplings. I only saw it because a leaf had stuck to the twist and flashed the wrong kind of shine. Beneath it, a scatter of fresh scuff marks and 1 flattened imprint where a body had fallen recently. Whoever said it had practiced. I stepped back the way I'd come. At camp I broke down the tarp and stuffed my pack in 5 minutes that felt like one long sound. The road was 3 miles, a ranger station another 8. I kept to the trail center, eyes on the ground where feet belong, and not on the woods where worry grows. I didn't run. Running reads like guilt. The station at Red Alder Gate is a squat cinder block with a porch and a soda machine that never works. Inside, the duty ranger listened while I kept it simple. Prints around my camp, tacks in the trees, a tripcord. He asked about tread details and whether the cord had a slip knot or a fixed loop. Then he brought out a Ziploc bag full of recovered trail, markers, orange and red tacks, and a sheet of boot prints they were trying to match to thefts from cars at pullouts. The pattern was close. He said they'd been dealing with a pair working weekend nights, one moving through camps to see who traveled light, another waiting near the road. He didn't make it dramatic. He said it the way people say weather. He offered the overflow loop behind the station for the night. Pride told me to decline and keep moving. I took the offer. There were 2 other cars there, one with bikes on the rack, one with a dog nose smeared on the rear window. I read a paperback until the light went thin, and then I dozed with the hatch cracked and my pack under my knees. Near midnight, something brushed the door. Not a bump, fingers. The handle flexed and clicked against the latch. A slow test, then another. I didn't move. In the rearview mirror, a shadow lifted and lowered, patient. It tried the next car, then the next, skipping the one with the dog. When it came back to mine, I hit the horn and lights. The figure folded into itself, made of elbows and fast angles, and slipped away between picnic tables. The dog in the other car went off like a fire alarm. A porch light snapped on at the station. 2 deputies arrived 10 minutes later without siren and walked the loop with flashlights sweeping low. They came back with a small pocketful of orange tacks and a length of thin cord tied to a twig. One deputy said, "They love the overflow. People feel safe here and leave windows cracked." By noon the next day I was home. The ranger called a week later to say they'd pulled camera stills from a cedar across the road. A hooded figure working down the line. Headlamp off, hands in thin gloves. They didn't catch a face. They rarely do. I replaced my tent lines with heavier cord that doesn't look like a trap when it crosses a path. And I added a whistle to my key ring because noise you control is a kind of fence. I still go out. I still look for the green light under big trees. But now when the forest goes blank all at once, I don't tell myself it's only weather. I check the ground where feet belong, and I move my camp before dark. The woods aren't out to get you. Most nights they don't care you exist. It's the people using the woods like a room with no locks that you watch for. You learn the difference, and you go anyway. Because quiet is rare and worth the work. It was a cool Sunday morning in late May when I started the loop around Willowcut Ridge. A trail I used to run back when my knees forgave anything. This time I brought a pack and a reasonable plan. 12 miles counterclockwise, a lunch at the overlook, and back to the trailhead before weather built. The first hours were familiar, the creek crossings, the cedar smell where wind funneled through a notch, the low hum that I've always assumed is distant highway, even when there isn't one. I passed 2 groups headed out, and then it was empty human-wise. Just the sound of my boots and the soft slap of a strap against my shoulder. Around mile 5 the ridge narrows, and the path threads between old fence posts from when someone thought grazing up here made sense. I was passing one of those posts when my phone buzzed in my pocket. No bars, but the screen lit and a voice memo began to play on its own. It was my voice, or near enough to twist my stomach, me saying hello, then saying, "Hey, I'm by the big rock, can you see me?" I stopped cold. The rock I just passed is the landmark everyone uses to meet at the overlook. I hadn't recorded anything. I don't even use voice memos. I turned the phone off, took the battery case off out of habit, and kept walking. 2 minutes later, from ahead on the trail, I heard my name. Clear, not a bird trick or wind in wire. My first thought was simple. Someone I knew must be up here. Then the voice called the wrong nickname, one I hadn't used since college, drawn out in a tone nobody uses on a mountain. I answered without meaning to, "Yeah?" And as soon as I did, a second voice answered from behind me with the same word in the same cadence. Like it had recorded what I'd just said and played it back a beat late. I've worked enough with search teams to know that sound does strange things in trees. I also know the look of a laid snare. 10 yards off the trail, a stick leaned at an unnatural angle against a sapling, and a path of flattened grass pointed into the brush where no one would walk by chance. I kept to the tread. The fence posts continued like sentries. At the next one, there were fresh shavings at the base. Someone had scraped a notch and tied, then untied something there. Farther on, a plastic grocery bag fluttered from a branch. The handle looped in a way that felt more like a signal than litter. At the overlook I expected the usual. Wind. An empty bench, and the view of black timber rolling to a far pale strip of reservoir. The bench was occupied. A man in a gray hoodie sat with his back to me, hands in his pockets. The hoodie had a dark, uneven patch on the shoulder, like someone had wiped it on a truck bed. I said hello from a polite distance, and he didn't turn. He said, "Hey, I'm by the big rock, can you see me?" In my voice. Not perfect, too smooth on the vowels, but close enough to hit bone. I felt the small, foolish heat of wanting to see his face, to make it ordinary. I didn't move closer. I backed up until the bench edge was out of sight and stepped behind a cedar where I could see the approach. Bootsteps came up from the south spur, 2 sets, one faster than the other. A pair of teenagers in cotton hoodies jogged into the clearing, breathless and joking. They saw the bench and stopped on the dime of decision you only learn by being outside a lot. The man didn't move. One of the kids said hello. The man said hello back in a woman's voice that sounded like every voicemail you've ever gotten in a parking garage. The kid laughed because that's what you do when something lands wrong, and there are 2 of you to make it less. Then the man stood up. He was older than I'd guessed from behind, wiry, with the blunt, careful hands of someone who works with wire or small engines. He asked if they'd mind helping him lift something heavy off the far side of the bench. The kid on the left took a step. The other put his hand on his friend's sleeve and shook his head once. I stepped into the open and waved like I knew them. "Sorry I'm late," I said, and I let my voice carry the relief you use when someone has waited for you on purpose. The man looked at me for the 2 seconds it takes to inventory risk. He smiled an inch too slow and said he'd left his water back down trail. He walked past me, not brushing, and took the north spur in a loose, easy stride. The kids and I stood a minute pretending to admire the reservoir. When he was out of earshot, I told them I'd walk with them to the junction. I didn't say why. They didn't ask. We found a coil of light cord near the next post, and a plastic bag with 2 granola bars and a folding knife in it, the kind of bait that reads like kindness. We kicked the bag under a log and kept moving. At the junction, we met a pair of district volunteers stapling a fresh closure notice for a side trail that had washed out. I told them about the man and the mimic voice and the notches on the posts. One of them, older, nodded like he was lining up old information with new. He said they'd had reports all spring of calling voices and found line. He called to ask a ranger to swing the loop. He didn't roll his eyes at me. He didn't make a joke. He said thanks, and he meant it. Back at the trailhead lot, a silver sedan I didn't recognize idled with the windows down and no plates on the bumper, only a temporary tag in the corner of the windshield. I wrote the number down and put it in my pocket without telling myself a story about what that meant. I drove home the slow way, staying behind trucks on purpose. That night my phone buzzed twice on the table with no caller ID and 2 seconds of silence before disconnecting. I turned it off and put it in a drawer. I still walk Willowcut. I leave earlier. I don't wear earbuds. I tell people behind me when I'm going to pass. When someone calls my name and I can't see their mouth move, I don't answer. Most of what scares us out there has teeth or weather in it, but some of it has hands and a plan. The reserve is still the same ridgeline and the same wind in the cedars it was when I first ran it. And most days the scariest thing you'll meet is your own breath on a climb. But on the days when the forest throws your voice back to you just a little too well, it pays to remember that the quiet isn't empty. It's only quiet. It was the 2nd week of October when I drew the late shift out of Buckthorn Station, the small ranger post that sits where the forest road turns from cracked asphalt to gravel and then to whatever the weather decides. My job was straightforward on paper: check the closure gates, swap cards in 3 trail cameras, and put fresh warning placards on a washout we kept thinking we'd fixed. It had rained the day before, the kind of cold fall rain that shakes leaves loose in sheets, and the road wore a new pattern of ruts I could feel through the wheel even at 15 miles an hour. I signed the log, grabbed a handful of zip ties, and headed out just before dusk because I'd learned, in this district, that daylight is when you make mistakes you can see, and dark is when you meet the ones you can't. The first camera hangs above a junction where the Willow Fen path meets the surface spur. If you climb the berm and duck under the old fence rails, you can see the fen open like a bruise between black spruces. The camera card popped out gritty, like someone had handled it with dusty gloves. I pocketed it and clicked in a fresh one. On the old post below, someone had pressed 3 red map tacks into the wood at perfect finger spacing. That's not a thing hikers do by accident. I took a photo, bagged the tacks, and told myself they'd blown in stuck to a lost trail map. Lying to yourself is part of working alone. The second camera sits at shoulder height on a hemlock where the path narrows between a blowdown and a rock ledge. It's a pinch point good for animals, better for people you want to count. I was lining the lens when I realized the hemlock bark around the strap was cleaner than it should have been. Somebody had taken the unit down and put it back. Not vandalized reset. The card in that one was brand new, too new to belong to us. We buy off-brand and these were labeled in bold type. I swapped it anyway, bagged the unfamiliar card, and made a note to check the serial later. I got to the washout last, a dirt bite taken out of the trail where spring water chews at the slope. We'd posted it with bright plastic signs and fresh tape last week. All of that lay face down in the mud now, stakes yanked and tape neatly folded like someone intended to reuse it. The rain had stitched the slope smooth, but there were footprints where someone had braced on a heel. Not boots. Trail runners. Narrow foot, long stride, shallow lugs. In the mud I could read how quickly whoever it was had moved, how sure their body was of the trail under the skin of mess. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. People who move like that either belong here or work at belonging. The difference matters not by the time I turned back. I'd used up the daylight. My headlamp threw a white tunnel on Duff and Stone, enough to make the trees into a chorus of trunks and the trail into an honest thread. I kept my pace measured. At night, your feet know you're lying if you try to act brave. On the last bend toward the road, movement brushed the beam. A figure stepped off the tread ahead and stood still the way healthy deer do. Head slightly turned, weight balanced to launch. Human, hooded sweatshirt. Hands down, not in pockets. The posture of someone who thinks they'll spook you if they move too fast, and wants to avoid the paperwork. Evening, I said. Because there's nothing wrong with pretending every path meeting is normal. Trails closed beyond the washout. Did you see the sign? He nodded once. His face stayed under the huge shadow. Just out for a run, after dark? Work late. I didn't ask where his light was. People lie better when you let them think you believe the visible part. I stepped to the uphill side of the tread so he could pass downhill if he wanted, kept my hands visible around the strap of my pack, and watched how he stood. Runners vibrate. This man didn't. His stillness felt deliberate, not tired. You with the park? He said, glancing at my radio. Volunteer. True enough for the paperwork. You head back toward the lot. Have a good night. He started past me, and I let the lamp fall to my boots so it wouldn't throw his face. He smelled like wet nylon and something sharp I couldn't place at first, adhesive like tape. Half a dozen steps later he stopped. You swap the cans? He asked, casual on the surface, too specific underneath. We do it on a schedule, I said. Helps us count wildlife. Yeah, he said, and kept moving, downhill quiet, strong ankles. I waited until he'd put enough trees between us to call it done, then looked where he'd stood. On the hemlock nearest the bend, there were 2 faint smudges at shoulder height where hands had pressed and released. Below them, a thin line of mud streaked across the bark like someone had dragged a strap, or slid a camera off its mount and back on by field dot at the lot. An older sedan I didn't recognize idled with lights off. Tail toward the road like it might want to leave or might want to watch who did. Temporary tag, corners curling from damp. I made a note of the number and walked into the station with the vague, unhelpful feeling that I'd been allowed to reach safety. Which is not the same as being safe. I should have locked the door before I set the cards on the desk and booted the old computer. But habits are a luxury when you've convinced yourself that your night is over. The first card came up blank except for wind and the backs of 2 elk at dawn. The second card, the unfamiliar brand, opened into a tidy folder structure with dates and clips named with times to the second. Whoever had handled our camera had overwritten the card with their own and then slipped it back, knowing most people wouldn't check until later. The first clip showed the hemlock pinch point under perfect, not park-issued infrared, sharp enough to count the threads on someone's sleeve. The second clip showed a couple with a dog pass by, laughing. The third showed me, an hour earlier, swapping the card. The fourth showed the hooded runner stepping into frame after I'd left, reaching up and adjusting the angle half an inch. He looked into the lens just long enough that I could see the shape of his mouth under the hood. He smiled. It wasn't a threat. It was a note. I know you know. I printed 3 stills, logged the time, and called the county office. The deputy on duty knew me and my tendency to over-document, and he did the thing good deputies do. He asked small, clear questions. Did the runner carry a light? Any logos? Did I get a plate on the sedan? I gave him what I had. He said they'd send a car by to drift the lot and check the pullouts down canyon where thefts had stacked up lately. Mostly coolers and stoves, sometimes a tailgate. I hung up and locked the door because there's a point in every night where the obvious becomes policy. Around 11, the sedan rolled past again, slow. It didn't pull in. It didn't need to. The next morning the deputy called to say they'd found a different temporary tag on the same model car 3 miles down. Flapping on one corner, number hand-altered. The way people do when they want to look compliant at a glance. They'd also pulled a camera from a cedar near the overflow lot, hung with a strap identical to ours, watching not the trail but the cars. I drove the loop with him that afternoon and showed him the smudges at the hemlock and the kofa washout where the tape had been folded and saved. He took it all in without pretending to have an elegant answer. They're doing recon, he said at last. Mark camp density, swap our cards so we don't see what we need to see, and tag folks who travel light. Friday night's most active. You scared him a little last night. I didn't feel like I scared anyone. You were where he didn't plan on you being, the deputy said. And that counts. We set a new camera higher, out of easy reach. At an angle that caught the old angle and the hands that might rise to find it. We logged the sedan's pass-through times off the station camera and forwarded the temporary tag list to the state patrol to see who bought what and where. None of it was dramatic. None of it was story-worthy in the way people like their forest stories to be. But that night, when I signed out again into dark, I felt the comfort of having nudged the odds. I still walk past that hemlock. Some evenings, someone has pressed fresh fingers into the bark and rubbed them off on their jeans. The tacks show up and disappear. I haven't seen the runner again, not up close. That's fine. I'm not interested in being brave. I'm interested in being present where presence changes things. If you hike alone on our side of the district and you pass a camera you didn't notice yesterday, that's us trying to put daylight where someone preferred the dark. And if the woods feel quieter than they should all at once, it might be weather. Or it might be someone 100 yards ahead, listening for your stride and deciding if you look like a person who pays attention. Be that person. It doesn't make you fearless. It makes you harder to schedule. It was the first warm weekend in April when my friend Mara talked me into an overnight on the north shore of Larkspur Reservoir. A body of water long enough to pretend it's a lake if you squint and forget. You're standing on a dam built by men with slide rules. The campground had been closed since a windstorm took the pines down like lines of dominoes in January. But the shoreline 2 miles in was open if you were willing to walk. We parked at the day-use lot, shouldered dry bags, and followed the old maintenance road along the water where the hills curved in and out like sleeping animals. Mara carried 2 rods in one hand and set a rhythm with the other. tapping the butt of a paddle against her thigh as if we were marching instead of wandering. The sun felt good after months of gray. I would have said yes to anything that promised a different color. We made camp where a cleft in the bank cut a pocket out of the wind. Dinner was rice and a packet of something salty. We sat with our backs to a drifted log and watched the opposite shore change from tree shapes to a flat strip of shadow. Someone across the water fired up a small engine, a generator by the sound of it, and then shut it down again after a few minutes. The reservoir carries sound like a dish. We heard a laugh we couldn't place to age. We heard a clunk that could have been a cooler lid or a trunk. Mara looked at me and raised an eyebrow. Thought the campground was closed. It is, I said. Closure signs get ignored the way fences do, more out of habit than malice. We fished at dusk the way you do when you more interested in being part of the scene than adding to your dinner. After dark, the opposite shore sprouted 3 lights that didn't belong to stars. They moved low and slow along the contour of the beach. Not headlamps too steady, too level. ATVs, Mara guessed. The lights didn't bob. They slid. After a minute, one bright dot jumped to the left, then to the right, and held steady on a point halfway up a dead snag beyond our camp. Laser? I said before thinking. The dot slid off the snag and drifted along the bank toward us, more playful than threatening. We killed our lantern by reflex and sat still. For a moment nothing moved. Then a tiny high insect sound reached us, wrong for April rotor whine. A drone crossed the water, backlit to us by the last smear of sky. It carried no visible light, but a faint red flash pulsed under its belly like a heartbeat. It stopped above our cove and hovered. People fly drones out here to find lost jigs and take sunset pictures they forget to look at later. But this one held steady in the dark over a closed shore and wore a light only someone standing where we couldn't see would notice. It pivoted a few degrees. The sound tickled the air inside my ear rather than filling it, and then it drifted back across the reservoir toward the dim lights and the laughter that hadn't happened again. Mara breathed out. That's not just kids. Probably not, I said. I wasn't sure what it was. The park had shut the campground after the storm and kept it shut while contractors tried to price the cleanup. Sometimes closures are about safety. Sometimes they're about budget. Sometimes, as we learn later, they're invitations to people who prefer gates without gatekeepers. We talked about hiking back to the car in the dark and decided the smarter move was to make less of ourselves. We pulled the tent lower between drift logs, didn't light anything, and turned our phones off because a powered rectangle throws a mile farther than you think. The wind came up and made a low, constant noise. That was good. Constant noise is a blanket dot near midnight. Headlights splashed white on the far trunks and held there without moving. Either someone had angled a truck toward the trees to work by light, or they wanted to see if anyone moved on the opposite bank when the world got bright. We didn't. The lights clicked off again. The drone's thin hum returned, nearer, and scrawled a lazy figure 8 along the shoreline. It paused over us once more, long enough that I felt the outline of myself on the ground in a way that made me want to stand and wave to break the geometry. I didn't dot by 2. The lights were gone, or steady in the way coolers and tents are steady on a quiet shore. We slept in sections. In the blue that isn't yet morning, we packed without fuss and started back along the maintenance road, speaking only when a question required an answer. A mile from the lot, the road turns up and away from the water and passes under a cut where rockfall leaves marbles of stone on the tread. Halfway up the grade, a pickup eased out from behind a screen of alder and blocked the lane at an angle. No plates. A square of paper in the rear window where a temporary tag should be, too far to read, and a trailer hitch that had dented enough posts to leave a story in steel. The driver stepped out. Younger than me by a decade solid, clean ball cap, calm. "Y'all camping back there?" He asked, like we were strangers he'd happily help if we were broken down. Fishing and walking. Mara said before I could, bright in a way that made me catch up. We're headed out now. You know if the contractor crew is working today? We saw a drone last night doing survey stuff. He smiled. The kind of smile that isn't about humor, yeah? Survey. Yeah, I said, letting the word land like a fact I trusted. If they're clearing hazard trees today, we'll give them space. Don't want to be under a saw. He stared a long second, measuring what we were trying to sell, that we were the kind of people who believed in crews and schedules and the reasons signs exist. Then he stepped aside and waved us through. Roads rutted, he said. Take it slow. We did. In the mirror I saw him watch us until the grade broke and the turn hit him dead at the lot. 3 cars sat with windows fogged from the night. No fresh glass on the ground. A posted printout on the kiosk announced the campground would remain closed pending contract award. I wrote down the make and color of the truck, even though I knew how far a note like that would travel. As far as the deputy willing to drive a loop had time to drive. We didn't call from the lot. We drove into town, found coffee, and then I called the ranger desk because the thing you learn is that details you tell right away are facts and details you tell later are stories. 2 days after, a warden called back to say they'd walked the far shore with county. They found a campsite tucked back in a pocket the wind doesn't reach, a generator under a tarp, and a table with a box of labels and a roll of bag tags used by people who move product that isn't fish. No arrests. No one in residence. He thanked me in the formal way reports demand and said if we camped again to keep doing what we did, make small, smart choices and leave before anything forces big ones. I still like that. Shoreline in April. The sun off water is a medicine without a copay. And even on a closed bank the geese think they own the deed. But now when I see steady, level lights slide along a dark contour, I think less about kids on a TVs and more about how some people prefer the woods when rules bend. The difference between adventure and trouble in a place like Larkspur is usually the time you choose to pack. We packed early that morning and walked out with our names still small in the world. That felt like winning in a way I recognize. Not dramatic, not the kind you post. Just the kind that lets you go again next weekend and pretend for a few hours that a drift log is a good backrest and a quiet cove is only a cove. It was the last week of August when I finally took the 4-day loop I'd been promising myself since spring. A horseshoe trail through alderbar forest that rises onto a shoulder of granite and drops back into hemlock. Day 1 slid by like a postcard. Day 2 brought the weather that makes you grateful for the weight of your jacket. By late afternoon, the clouds had closed and the trail ran wet like a gutter. I decided not to be proud about it and aimed for a public shelter marked on the old map, a 3-sided cabin with a tin roof and a ledger nailed to the wall, where people leave notes about mice and kindness. The shelter was there, though public had become theoretical. A blue tarp hung across the open side, tied neat at the corners and pinned with small stones like someone who knew sales had done the job. Inside, a folding cot leaned against the wall, a 5-gallon bucket sat with a lid on, and a camp stove, white gas, old but cared for, rested on a plank table. Whoever had been here recently had swept the floor, which is how you can tell you're dealing with someone who thinks of a place as theirs. I called out rather than just stepping in. After a moment, a man's voice came from behind the shelter. "Hey, weather drove you in?" He came around pulling a small sled made from a kid's toboggan with PVC runners screwed to the bottom. Not much on it. A duffel, a coil of rope, a canvas bag printed with a hardware store logo. He wore a rain jacket without a brand, a cap with the bill frayed square, and a beard you grow when clippers are a choice you don't make for a while. "Mind if I wait out the storm?" I asked. "Doors open," he said. smiling like the tarp was a door. "Name's Cole. I keep the mice out of the oatmeal." Inside, he took one side, I took the other. We traded the small information you trade to make sharing space feel less like trespass, where we'd started, how far we meant to go, whether lies we believed that morning. He said he was doing trail work as a temp, brushing back encroached sections, scouting for blowdowns ahead of a crew. The rope and sled made sense of that. He boiled water with practiced economy, handed me a cup, and didn't ask any questions he didn't need answers to. Rain came proper after dark, slow at first, then loud enough to erase footsteps and the small sounds that tell you if you're alone. We talked less. The ledger on the wall had entries going back a decade, names, dates, quick sketches of deer. 2 weeks earlier someone had written, "Thanks to the guy up here keeping this tidy, coffee is a blessing." Below that, in newer ink, a neat hand had added, "Please pack out what you pack in." Not a landfill. I liked both sentiments. Near midnight, after our talk had ended in the way talk does, a thin tone rose and fell somewhere outside. Not an animal. Electronic. Cole sat up, listened, then reached into his duffel and pulled out a small handheld radio scanner. He turned the knob. The tone stopped, returned, slid a few kilohertz. He found it and held it between us. A burst of fast beeps spilled out, then a voice that sounded like a voting machine. "Channel test, channel test." He clicked it off and set it down. "Survey crew," he said. "They tag points and send back a quick ping." "In the rain?" I asked. He shrugged. "Schedules aren't made by weather." I must have slept after that, because the next thing that woke me was the zipper sound of the tarp lifting against the wind. I sat still. The taut line of night sharpened around us, and a shape leaned into the opening, outlined as a darker piece of dark. Cole spoke first. "Shelter's full." The shape didn't answer. A gloved hand reached in, quick as a trick, and slid the cot toward the opening. Cole moved faster than I thought he could, pinning the cot with a boot. "Full," he said again, voice flat now. The hand withdrew. Footsteps retreated softly. No splash, like the person had learned how to make weight look like weather. Cole retied the tarp lower. 2 new knots in half the time my fingers would have needed. "Survey crew?" I asked. He didn't answer. We let the rain fill the room where our words would have gone. At dawn, I packed. I thanked him for the corner and the water and stepped out to the small clearing with a mind to pretend. It had just been a night in the woods. 10 yards from the shelter, at eye level on a hemlock, 3 bright blue thumbtacks marked a line you'd follow if you were new. Another hemlock, another set, inches lower, like someone had been tired or shorter. 100 feet farther, a strip of orange flagging hung from a branch at a height you'd think was meant for elk. The trail itself went left. The tacks encouraged right into a narrow run of brush that pinched at knee height. A branch leaned across that pinch at exactly shin level. If you caught it going fast, it would take you down into a web of deadfall someone had made look natural. I returned to the shelter. "Your survey crew set some training aids," I said. Cole looked at me, and the smile he'd used the night before stayed in his beard instead of his eyes. "People get creative out here," he said. "You headed east or west?" "East. Stay on the blazes, not the pretty line." "Copy," I said. "Because you talk like work when work is being done." I hiked slow, reading the ground the way you read a paragraph that might have hidden meanings. Twice I found the honest tread turned dull under pine duff, where someone had swept intentionally, like a stage. Twice I stepped over wire, because wire can live anywhere and doesn't care if you meant well. When the sun pushed through and the rain thinned to a suggestion, I cut down to the creek where stone told me truth. Water goes where it must, and so do boots that slip. There were no prints on the flat rock, which meant anyone working the diversion liked dry feet or didn't come down this way. That narrowed the choices of which ridge they Favored. By mid-afternoon, I reached a trail junction with a signpost I remembered as straight and found it at a lean that made the arrow for east read like south, not a storm thing. The post hole had been widened and reset. I took a photo, sent the location from the first high spot where a bar reluctantly appeared, and added enough words for a ranger to decide whether to walk or drive in. At the lot, a county cruiser idled. The deputy asked if I was the one who'd called about the sign. I was. He said they'd been dealing with a summer's worth of creative routing, markers pulled and rehung, cairns rebuilt in the wrong direction. Blowdowns spun to look passable when they weren't. Mostly what it buys someone is time. They walk behind you unseen while you go see what they've laid out. Then check your car while you prove you're gullible. You didn't take the pretty line, he said, nodding at my boots. Good. I asked him if the shelter was in the system to be closed when people claimed it. He shook his head. We don't like closing things because closing them just seeds them. But we'll swing by and say hello. I thought about Cole's careful knots, the neat sweep of the floor, the scanner that found the beeps like he'd tuned to them every night for weeks. I couldn't fit him into clean boxes. Helpful is a shape that can wear a lot of hats. Back home, I looked up the temp trail work roster the district posts sometimes. No Cole doesn't mean anything. Lists lag. A week later, I went back with a friend and found the blue tacks gone and the wire coiled and tucked under a log, like someone planned to use it again when the audience changed. The cot was still in the shelter, the ledger still on the wall. On the latest page, in neat block letters I recognized, someone had written, "Pack out what you pack in. Use the trail, not the shortcut. Not everyone out here is lost." I still think about the hand at the tarp and the way rain can make a plan bolder by hiding it. I go back anyway. I follow blazes even when the pretty line looks kinder. I sweep floors. I leave notes. If the forest teaches a lesson you can use back in town, it's this: if a thing offers you something for free, an easier path, a dry room, ask what it wants in return. And make sure you're the one deciding. It was a warm Friday in late July when my neighbor, Tom, convinced me to do an overnight along the Figment Creek Trail. A name someone had given it decades ago when maps still had jokes in them. The plan was simple: 5 miles out along the creek, fish the pools until dusk, camp on a bar of rounded stones, and walk back before any of our obligations remembered our names. I'd done Figment alone. The fun of going with Tom was that he notices different things: birds by their sounds, rock layers by their colors, the way fresh boot tread looks when it's headed where it shouldn't. We started late because life, which meant we hit the quiet part of the afternoon when the woods cool and the creek sounds bigger than it is. The first 2 miles were clean for a trail that mostly keeps to itself. Past the old bridge abutment, we found damage, a series of cairns rebuilt too tall, each one with a stick pointing not along the creek but toward a side gully. I kicked one over and the rocks fell in a way that said they'd been placed, not inherited by flood. Tom squatted, touched a dark smear on one stone, and rubbed his fingers together. "Grease," he said. "They painted a few so they look wet and new. Why bother?" I asked. "So it looks like the latest flow did it," he said, standing. "You trust what you think nature did. We stuck to the actual tread, which is less obvious than the pretend one someone had curated. But it has the honesty of being the way feet travel when no one is trying to convince them of a story." At mile 4, the creek widened into a slow pool that held the reflection of a hemlock line like a drawn thing. We dropped packs and fished. Tom pulled 2 out quick, shook them loose, let them slide back. He whistled when he's happy because he doesn't know he's doing it. I heard the whistle rise, fade, and return to us from farther up the creek with a half-second delay. "Echo," I said. "There's no wall for it," Tom said, eyes going toward the bend. He tried the tune again. It came back wrong, notes in the right places but the breath too even, like a recording played through bad speakers. Someone else, I said, again for the comfort of pretending that naming a thing controls it. We packed sooner than we meant to and moved toward a gravel bar we'd seen on the way in. One with a view of both bends and nowhere for a person to step into our small world without being seen first. The bar had footprints. Of course ours from earlier, a pair heading the other way with a deep heel like someone carried more than they planned. And a third set that made no sign of edge. Toes straight in, straight out, crisp under the small stones like the feet had been dry when they walked. That last is a trick you only notice after you've camped on riverstones a lot. Everything out here is damp unless you're working edges that aren't supposed to be walked. We put the tent back amid the cottonwood, drift and kept our cooking simple. As the sky went the color of a bruise you get from bumping into a table, we heard a tinkle like glass and a cough that wasn't anyone's first cough. It came from the bend upstream, where the pretend cairn line had pointed. Tom looked at me in a way that asked a question and also answered it. He wanted to see, he didn't want to see. We stayed put. At full dark, a small amber light winked once at chest height on the far bank. Not a headlamp. Too warm. Not a cigarette. Too steady. It winked again and then moved horizontally toward the gully the cairns had told a story about. A moment later, another light winked at the edge of our bar. A glow barely there, the color of a charging LED. I found it by accident with the side of my eye. A button-sized light stuck to a stone with a dab of epoxy. The kind people use to mark trip hazards on stages. Two more lay farther back along a line that made our tent the final dot. If you drew it. Tom clicked his lamp on and swept the bar. Three more of the tiny lights blinked to life like insects angry at being disturbed. He clicked off again. The river held its breath. "Let's go," he said, voice level. We packed in the dark by touch, which is slower but quieter if you know your gear. The trick is to decide you're already leaving, and then make the leaving as boring to watch as possible. We crossed to the near bank where the rocks were larger and less willing to roll underfoot. Halfway across, the fake echo whistled again, our tune. Same mistake, dead in the lungs. My scalp tried to leave my skull while the rest of me pretended to be a person who didn't care. Back on tread. We moved until the woods felt like they'd taken our shapes back into themselves and not held them up for any audience. We stopped once to listen. Behind us on the bar, a low, quick scrape sounded like someone dragging something heavy just far enough to unbury a corner. Farther up, a small engine rattled for a second and died. Generator again, or a quad. Hard to tell over the soft sound of moving water. We kept walking. At mile 2, a new sign hung at shoulder height where there hadn't been one that afternoon. Trail closed ahead, washout. It pointed back the way we'd come. Tom laughed once, no humor, and took a photo. The lot held 3 cars we didn't recognize and ours, which we recognized better than we wanted to because someone had brushed the dust off the rear hatch around the place, where a plate would be on a different make. The brush had left a smear in a shape I knew from the tiny lights on the stones. I wiped it with my sleeve and the smear became finger marks. 4 neat ovals and a thumb dot. We drove to the diner because that's what you do when you've made a choice that leaves you more awake than is useful. Coffee is a tool as much as a drink. Tom called the non-emergency number and described the cairns, the LEDs, the fake sign, and the almost whistle. The dispatcher listened and asked good questions a person behind a desk can ask. A deputy came by, wrote down our details, and said they'd sweep Figment overnight with 2 units and a warden if they could pull one. A week later, a ranger we know called to say they'd found the gully stashed with coolers and rods, and 3 plastic totes full of things campers don't notice missing until they're home. Headlamps, pocket stoves, knives, the kind of items you can fence without anyone calling the paper. They'd also pulled small adhesive lights off a dozen stones and logs across 3 miles of creek and bagged them with tags. No arrests. People move when attention does. I go back to Figment, because places aren't ruined by the worst thing you learn in them. They're made larger by the decisions you remember to bring next time. Now when I see a cairn too tall for the trail and too tidy for the flood, I kick it down. When a whistle comes back wrong, I don't answer. If a sign appears where it wasn't 5 hours before, and the arrow points towards sense that doesn't match the ground, I trust the ground. And when someone asks me what scares me out there, I tell them the same thing I tell myself. Not the dark, not the water, not the silence. It's the work some people put into making their problems into your path. It was the first cold front of September when the call came down to check the line cabins on the western stretch of Deaton Ridge. They're relics. Built in the 40s when the district thought smoke chasers needed roofs between lookouts. Now they sit as storage for old tools and winter salt blocks. But every autumn we check for storm damage, and the animals that decide lumber makes a good den. The drive out takes an hour, the walk another 2 if the road has washed, and that morning it had. The maples had gone from green to copper overnight, a sign of the quick temperature drop that makes fog a near certainty. I left the truck at mile 18 and walked in. The air had that damp cold that carries sound farther than it should. The trail dipped through a saddle, then rose into pine that smells like metal when it's wet. The cabin sat where I remembered, squatting behind a screen of firs. Roofline caved a little at one corner. I jotted notes for repair. Flashing loose, shutters missing, door hinge rusted. Nothing out of pattern. Then I saw the tire tracks. They came up the old service road, through 2 locked gates, one still padlocked. Both locks were uncut, just open and reclosed. The treads were narrow, not truck or a TV, generator wheel or small trailer maybe. I followed the tracks to the side of the cabin, where a flat patch of earth showed boot prints. 2 pairs, both heavier than mine. They'd paced in a circle, then one had knelt near the foundation vent. The vent screen had been unscrewed, not pried. Inside was a coil of wire and a folded tarp. Whoever they were methodical and unhurried. Inside, the cabin smelled of old sap and something sweetly rancid solvent or fuel. A lantern sat on the shelf, new but burned. Next to it, a small stack of blank trail logs, identical to the official ones we keep, but none had a district stamp. Each header read Ridge Activity Record, like someone had made their own system. I flipped through. The handwriting was blocky, neat, each entry a date, a time, and a note like 2 in, 1 out, or lights above bridge. No initials, no names. Last entry, dated 2 nights before, said 17 passed south, 2 stayed. I closed the book and looked at the doorframe. Someone had etched small lines into the wood, just deep enough to catch grime. 23 of them, clustered above the latch. If they were counting nights, they'd been here almost a month. The radio barely reached this far. I stepped outside, found a ridge where a weak signal caught, and called in a routine check. Cabin intact, minor damage. Evidence of entry. Investigating. I didn't add the part about the logbooks because that's the kind of detail that needs context and daylight. Back inside. I opened the stove door to make sure nothing living had nested in it. A folded map lay on the grate, weighted by a small stone. It wasn't a topo, just a hand-drawn outline of the ridge and creek system. Red pencil lines looped around 4 marked X's labeled with initials. FR, NC, WP, and CG. Those are the abbreviated names of our other cabins. Whoever drew it knew our layout and had been tracking more than repairs. By then the fog had thickened to the point where even the sound of dripping branches felt muffled. I stepped out to lock up and caught a faint hum, mechanical, like a small engine down in the valley. It rose and fell irregularly, generator or a TV muffled by trees. The kind of noise that lives at the edge of hearing, just long enough to make you wonder if it's real. I waited until it stopped, then turned the padlock and noted the time. On the hike back, I found new flagging, black electrical tape wrapped around branches at intervals that weren't ours. It followed the line downhill, parallel to the service road. I cut 2 off and pocketed them. At the truck, the dirt had dried enough to hold my boot prints beside the older ones I'd made that morning. No new tire tracks. Back at headquarters, I turned in the repair note and the map. My supervisor stared at it for a while, then pulled out a stack of photos from a box marked Spring Sweep. They were of confiscated trail cams from illegal grow sites we'd cleared months earlier. The red X's matched those coordinates. "Looks like someone's still using our cabins for staging," he said. "We'll send a crew Monday." The next day was Sunday. I drove back anyway. Curiosity is a habit that pretends to be duty. The fog held low over the ridge, and the tire tracks were newer, overlapping mine. I stopped 50 yards short of the cabin, killed the engine, and listened. No generator. No voices. At the door, the padlock hung open, swinging lightly as if nudged. Inside, the air felt wrong warm, used. The stove was lit. On the table, a new page in the fake log read, "1 in, 1 out." The rest of the book was gone. I left without touching anything else. Walked to the truck and kept driving until the ridge vanished behind cloud. Officially, the report says, "Unoccupied, evidence of illegal entry, no contact." That's what I typed. What I didn't write was the part where, in the mirror halfway down the service road, a second truck nose appeared out of the fog, parked where mine had been, engine off. Window cracked just enough for the outline of a face. I didn't stop to verify. Every time I do that loop now, I lock each door twice and photograph the latch. Small rituals help. The new padlocks we use have a blue coating that shows scratches easily. The one on that cabin never holds its shine. It was early June when my cousin and I decided to hike the Split Creek Trail before the summer permits started. He'd just come back from a season doing contract survey work and wanted a walk without a clipboard. The trail runs along a narrow gorge carved through basalt, shaded enough to stay damp even when the ridges bake. We carried light, just hammocks, food, and one radio. The plan was to reach the bridge at mile 8, camp by the water, and return the next day before the crowd found the road. The first stretch felt good. Sun through ferns, air thick with that mineral smell of wet stone. Around mile 3, we hit our first bit of odd, a stack of new stones at a bend, forming a neat arch over a rusted steel rod. Not the usual cairn, too deliberate. My cousin said it was leftover survey marking, probably something his crew forgot to dismantle. I didn't argue. At mile 6, we came to a side cut that dropped toward the creek. A faint footpath had been cleared recently, fresh boot prints, leaves turned underside up by saws. We stuck to the main trail. When we reached the bridge, a plank span of old timber over dark water, I noticed the bolts were gone from one corner. They'd been loosened, not broken. The handrail wobbled. The kind of thing you only see if you test it. We set up camp 50 yards downstream on a gravel patch. The gorge walls rose on both sides, steep enough that echoes came back too sharp. Dinner was quick. The evening cooled faster than it should have for June. Around twilight, we heard metal on wood, light, rhythmic, like someone tightening something with a wrench. It came from the bridge. We both froze. My cousin mouthed, "Maybe a fisherman?" But even saying it silently sounded stupid. We listened. The metallic sound stopped, replaced by a short crack of wood, then silence. I switched off my headlamp. A minute later, a faint glow appeared up the trail, a flashlight beam moving low to the ground, sweeping side to side. It crossed the bridge once, then again slower, as if searching. The beam paused, aimed down toward our side of the creek, and held there for a long count. Then it vanished. We stayed still until our knees hurt. After 10 minutes, the forest took back its sounds, the slow drip, a frog, a distant owl. My cousin whispered that maybe someone had been fixing the rail. I didn't answer. At first light, we broke camp. The bridge looked normal from a distance. Up close, the boards on one side had been shifted, nails pulled, and reseated halfway. A thin wire ran under 2 planks, leading to a small box screwed to the underside of the rail. Inside was a camera module, lens angled at waist height toward whoever crossed. Not wildlife tech, cheap, retail stuff. We took a photo, backed off, and followed the creek downstream where it met the service road. The exit saved us 4 miles of trail. At the ranger station, the duty officer called in a field tech. He opened the box, popped the SD card, and frowned. It held 50 clips of hikers crossing the bridge, every one neatly time-stamped. The last clip showed our approach from the day before, ending as we stepped onto the first plank. The next file was blank, no image, just audio, the same metal-on-wood sound we'd heard from camp. After that, nothing. The officer said they'd found similar setups before, trail cams repurposed for theft tracking. Someone spots gear, logs when people pass, checks which cars are still parked. Mostly harmless if you catch it early, he said. They just want unattended stuff. A week later, my cousin called to say the trail had closed for maintenance after an incident at the bridge. A pair of hikers had gone through when the plank failed. One broken ankle, one twisted knee. The official notice blamed rot. But when the district updated their equipment list, every camera was accounted for except one, the model we'd found. I still walk Split Creek, but I stop before the bridge now. I fish from the bank and go home before dark. The gorge keeps its cool even in July. And sometimes I swear I hear that light wrench click up the canyon, the rhythm steady, patient. Like someone tightening the world one bolt at a time. It was the first Saturday after Labor Day when I signed on as a volunteer for a missing person search in Briar Notch Preserve. A patchwork of hardwood hills and old logging roads that holds cell service about, as well as a sieve holds water. The command tent sat in a gravel lot off County 14. Maps were clipped to plywood, radios laid out in a row like fish on ice. The missing hiker was a 27-year-old trail runner who'd texted a photo from the ridge at 3:11 p.m. the day before and hadn't been heard from since. The temperature had dropped overnight. If he was under a canopy without a bag, we had a window and not much more. I got paired with one full-time ranger and another volunteer. We were assigned a hasty line along the South Spur fast sweep, eyes on tread, check creek crossings, and obvious shelters. The ranger, a woman named Elena, set a brisk pace but kept it conversational in the way good leaders do when they need to hear if your voice tightens. We moved through the first mile without drama, wet leaves, a couple of fresh blowdowns, squirrel chatter that sounds like scolding if you grew up near trees. Every few minutes, Elena called the missing runner's name, paused, and listened for an answer that never came. Around the 2nd mile marker, we saw the first reflective sticker that wasn't ours, small silver squares thumbed onto bark at knee height. Elena frowned. "Those are not grid markers," she said. "Our team tags are 5-sided and high. These were square and low, placed to catch a narrow beam. We scraped one off and kept going. At a drainage, the trail flattened and braided. Boot prints overlapped, some new, some softened by yesterday's rain. A looping sneaker tread with an arrowhead toe kept appearing and disappearing. Maybe our runners, maybe not. We worked down the braid and hit the creek. On the far bank, in mud that held detail, a different print stepped off. Heavier boot, wide forefoot, shallow heel. The person had stood there long enough to twist once, as if deciding to go upstream or down. We went upstream 50 yards and found a pile of branches, stacked in a lean-to shape against a boulder. It looked plausible until you looked longer. No debris inside, no leaves on the ground disturbed, no sign that a person had knelt, lain, or even leaned. Staged, Alina said, as much to the notebook as to us. Maybe to pull resources this way. We radioed the find and were told to continue. 5 minutes later, a clear, bright whistle sounded from ahead. 3 short blasts, the universal distress call. We froze. Alina answered with our pattern, 1 long, 1 short. The response came quickly, 3 short again, then a voice faint, help. Over here. We moved toward it, not running, because running breaks ankles and breaks plans. The voice continued, calling the runner's first name correctly, and then the last name, too. That part made the hairs lift at the back of my neck. The name hadn't been on the general volunteer sheet, only the briefing. Hold, Alina said softly. We confirm before we commit. We paused at a trail split where an illegible signpost stood at an angle. The voice came from the left. A small reflective square winked low on a sapling to the right. I took 1 step that way to check it and saw a line of those squares stretching into brush thick enough to force a single file. Someone had marked a path. It wasn't the trail. Alina called again. Call sign for command? She asked the air. No answer. Describe where you are, she tried, using the prompt we teach lost hikers. Water, slope, trees. The voice repeated, over here, like it was a recording short on lines. The whistle blew 3 times, closer now. That was when I noticed it didn't tail off the way a breath-blown whistle does. It stopped like a sound effect clipped on a laptop. We backed to the junction and took the right-hand path toward high ground where the map showed a logging road we could use for better radio. 10 yards up, we could see where someone had brushed duff across the true tread to make it look less used, and it swept a false line clear. The false line hugged the slope where the leaf litter hid slick clay. If you followed the markers, you'd slip toward a tangle of windfall a person could disappear into for a while. We didn't follow it. On the ridge, the radio caught enough air to carry. Alina called in the stage shelter, the decals, and the voice. Command told us another team had found a small cache near the northern trailhead, a backpack with an external speaker, a cheap whistle, and a VHF handheld set to our region, no encryption. Just standard public frequencies. Someone had cut audio clips from our training materials and recorded names off the whiteboard. They'd been trying to pull teams off grid. How does that help them? Our other volunteer asked. Time, Alina said. Resources thin out. People get strung wider, cars sit longer. At noon, a team on the east side found the runner alive, but dehydrated. He'd sprained a knee and crawled into a rock gap to get out of wind. He hadn't heard any whistles. We walked out past the south lot with a slow relief that feels less like joy and more like quiet washing a room. 2 cars we didn't recognize sat with their trunks popped to the first Leadzua. Trick thieves used to advertise emptiness so passersby aren't tempted to break glass. No windows were broken. Nothing obvious was missing. A deputy rolled by an hour later and told us they'd picked up a sedan the previous night, driving slow loops around the pullouts. Temporary tag in the window, driver with 2 eager answers. They let him go. The plates are always temporary, the answer's always eager, and the timing always rides the edge of what can be charged. On my way home, fatigue hit in a thick wave. I stopped at a gas station off the highway and stood there longer than the pump required, watching sunlight the tops of maples along the chain-link fence like everything in the world would always be this simple. My phone buzzed with a message from command. Good work today. Debrief Tuesday. Reminder, no details on social. I still sign on when they ask. The forest doesn't owe anyone fairness, but the people searching inside it will keep trying to make it anyway. If you ever get lost out there and hear a whistle, answer, but answer with more than a whistle. Say the exact words about where you are. Ask for the command call sign. And if a voice keeps saying, "Over here," without telling you a single thing about the ground under its feet, don't let your good heart walk you into someone else's schedule. It was a clear Sunday morning in mid-October when I decided to push a solo loop along the Crooked Timber Traverse, a 14-mile route that strings together 3 old bridle paths and a forgotten logging road. I wanted to be back at the trailhead by late afternoon. The sky was the kind of blue that makes you believe weather forecasts and poor plans. I left a note on the dash with my route and start time the way people who've read too many cautionary tales do. And I stepped onto the path with a pace that felt like I had a head start on my better judgment. The first hours were plain good, leaf smell rising, frost still hiding in the shaded ditch lines, a woodpecker working a snag like a metronome. At mile 5, the bridle path met the logging road. The map called it Service 3B, but the sign at the junction had been replaced with a new cedar plank rooted with "Fire Detour" and an arrow. It didn't look official. The letters were too pretty, the paint too glossy. But it pointed where my map pointed, and the road looked traveled time recent, 2 tracks and a crown. I followed. A mile in, the detour spit me into a wide landing, the kind of flat the old crews used to turn trucks. In the center sat a dark green shipping container with both doors closed and a portable toilet shoved up against one side. A laminated sheet flapped on a nail, staging nitrogen monoxide public access. The font was the same as the sign back at the junction. The lock on the container was heavy, expensive, new. The pad sites around it were clean of the usual coffee cups and flagging scraps. It looked like a set someone had struck clean for the next scene. I walked the edge of the landing, found the logging road continuing on the far side, and kept moving. The road narrowed and became less road, more idea with grass in the middle. 10 minutes later, I hit a chain gate across it, padlocked to a post that hadn't been there last spring. On the gate hung a bright plastic trail arrow pointing back the way I'd come. I checked the map again. The traverse should have kept going. I decided to backtrack to the last known good sign and take the bridle path variant instead. On the way back through the landing, a truck rolled up from the lower spur. Dented white pickup, light bar inside the windshield, no markings. The driver wore a safety vest and one of those hard hats that make a certain kind of person stand taller. He waved me over. "Trails closed past the gate," he said. "Construction. Is the detour the bridle path?" I asked, playing the harmless user. "Yeah," he said. "Back out to the cedar sign, hang left." "Thanks," I said, and kept my face calm as I stepped away. I noticed a detail that didn't fit. The yellow vest had a tag stitched to it with a logo I knew from a company that had lost its forest maintenance contract 2 seasons ago. The vest was old stock. It could have been nothing. It could have been a detail my brain grabbed to justify the itch at the base of my neck. I took the bridle path variant and let the woods work medicine. It helped until it didn't. At a creek crossing, I found a string of small flags in the water-bright pink survey tape tied to pebbles to make them sink. They marked a straight line perpendicular to the flow. On the far bank, 2 boot prints faced back toward the landing, heels dug in like someone had watched a long time. I didn't like the feeling of being made part of a grid. 3 miles from the trailhead, the path climbed a shoulder and tilted toward an overlook with a view through the trees to the road. I could see the gravel lot and my car. A tan sedan idled 2 spaces over, driver's window down, one elbow out. A minute later, a dark SUV rolled in, took a slow pass, and left. The tan car stayed. I finished the last bit with that dull awareness that isn't quite fear, just math. At the lot, the tan sedan's driver, a man about my age, neat haircut, sunglasses despite the shade, looked at me like a clerk waiting for a decision. "They still working up the ridge?" he asked, tone friendly. "Looked like they wrapped," I said, opening my hatch, not turning my back, packing slow on purpose. He nodded, looked at my tires, then past me, as if something more interesting were about to arrive. I locked the car and walked to the kiosk to read the posted notices I already knew by heart. When I turned back, the sedan pulled out, slow enough to read my plate if that was the point. I sat in the car until my heart remembered the part where it isn't a device. Then I drove into town, parked at the grocery store, and sat again. It felt silly to feel relief surrounded by pumpkins and a sale on paper towels. 2 days later, the district posted a note online. Unauthorized signage had been installed at the Cook Timber Junction and removed. Public should ignore fire detour routes unless accompanied by official closures on the agency website. A friend who works maintenance texted to say they'd also found a shipping container, held on a day-to-day lease by a shell company, removed without notice. Inside, nothing but a pallet of empty cardboard boxes and a roll of stickers printed with arrows. I still run the Traverse. I don't follow glossy signs. When a person in a vest I don't recognize waves me to a better route, I check my own map and my own sense of where the land wants trails to go. Most days, the only thing waiting at the lot is the fact of my own car where I left it and the small pride of having kept to the path on paper. Some days, a sedan idles with the window down and a man with careful hair asks a question designed to make me name my day. I don't. I tell him the bathrooms are open and the loop was pretty and the leaves are early. If he wants more, he can bring a clipboard with the right logo and the kind of patience that lets a person walk 14 miles to get a simple answer.